The first time Clara Wright drove past the iron gates of Sycamore Hill in nearly 20 years. The same gravel that had once crunched under her bare feet now rolled beneath the tires of a black rental car with government plates. Her reflection, barely recognizable in the rearview mirror. The estate, once grand and meticulously kept, now bore the signs of slow decay peeling white paint on the columns, ivy growing wild along the stone walls, and shutters that clapped softly in the wind, like broken metronomes of a memory too stubborn to fade. It was the house where childhood had ended and her name had been dragged through the dirt. A house that still held the echoes of her mother's crying behind locked bedroom doors, and the way her father's voice had changed the night. He chose loyalty to money over his own blood. Clara had been 16 when the scandal hit, the news of missing money from the Wright Family Foundation, an anonymous tip in a police raid that had thrown her into the media circus. Her name and face splashed across every local paper, not as a victim, but as the problem, the rebel daughter who hacked into the foundation's account and exposed internal vulnerabilities. In truth, she'd uncovered what no one else had the courage to touch. Her uncle Raymond Wright's embezzlement of over $3 million, funneled through dummy scholarships and shell charities. But instead of justice, the Wrights did what old money families always did. They erased the evidence, paid off the right people, and blamed the weakest link, Clara. Overnight, she became a disgrace, expelled from school, disowned by her family, and sent off to live with distant relatives in Oregon, who didn't ask questions. What they hadn't expected was that Clara would rise quietly, invisibly through college, through law school, and through the system they once manipulated until the day she returned not as a Wright, but as a federal financial crimes investigator. With a case file bearing the same name that had once destroyed hers, Clara didn't announce her presence to the family when she arrived back in town. She checked into a hotel under her married name, walked the streets of the sleepy Massachusetts town like a stranger, and let the ghosts of her past wrap around her like fog. The Wrights were still there, of course. Uncle Raymond, now a philanthropic thought leader, her father clinging to a fragile position on the board, and her cousin Julian preparing to take over the estate. No one suspected that the quiet woman who came to speak to local officials about historical nonprofit audits was the same girl they had thrown out in disgrace. But Clara remembered every inch of that estate, every drawer, every closet, and every lie they told. Over the following weeks, she unearthed their secrets like bones from beneath the floorboards' records of forged tax returns, misallocated federal grants, and a falsified trail that led all the way back to the night she was scapegoated. She worked methodically, each discovery more damning than the last, storing evidence not on paper but across a network of secured drives and encrypted accounts, because she knew better now than to trust just to come knocking. No, she would deliver it herself. Clara sat in the corner booth of an old cafe near the town square, one she remembered from childhood, where her mother used to take her for lemon cake and soft smiles during better days. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon rolls curled through the air as she quietly reviewed documents on her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard with clinical precision. Each click, each keystroke was another stitch in the net she was building, a trap laced with dates, wire transfers, and falsified charity reports, all leading straight to Raymond Wright. She worked with silence as her ally, letting the town remain blissfully unaware of the fire about to ignite beneath its polished facade. She watched from afar as Raymond hosted wine-soaked fundraisers at Sycamore Hill, shaking hands with senators, baptizing himself in philanthropy the same way he had when she was a girl, his words sweet, his eyes cold. Julian, now in his early 30s, tried to mimic his father's public charm, but behind closed doors, Clara discovered the debts he was drowning in, the failing investments, the hidden gambling addiction, and the offshore accounts that traced back to hush money paid out to keep former employees silent. The Wright name had been built on legacy, on prestige, but it was hollow now, and Clara held the blueprint to collapse it brick by brick. One evening, dressed in muted colors and a pair of oversized sunglasses, she attended a fundraising gala. At the town hall under her married name, Clara Mitchell. The room was full of the same people who had turned their backs on her years ago, now older, more wrinkled, still dripping with counterfeit grace. Raymond stood on stage, boasting about the family's upcoming scholarship program, a charitable partnership with the university Clara had attended, and she had made sure that very university had begun a quiet investigation into Wright Foundation funds earlier that month. As he raised his glass, Clara's phone buzzed gently, an encrypted message from a journalist friend she trusted with her life. "We're in." Story runs next Friday, SEC preparing subpoenas. She smiled quietly, invisible in the crowd, while the room applauded the man who had stolen everything from her. Later that night, she drove to the edge of the Sycamore Hill estate, parked beneath the same gnarled tree where she used to read poetry in the summers, and watched as the lights in the house flickered behind stained glass windows. She imagined them sitting in the drawing room, Raymond, Julian, her father clinking glasses, assuming they were untouchable the way men like them always did. But Clara knew what they didn't. Power rooted in lies never last. The next morning, subpoenas were delivered to the Wright Foundation offices, discreet but undeniable. Emails started flying. Lawyers began scrambling. And Clara, ever the ghost in the machine, walked through the panic like a shadow. But the real dagger wasn't the exposure, it was what she had planned next. She wasn't just here to end the Wright legacy. She was here to make them feel what she felt: shame, isolation, betrayal. She had located the last missing piece of her revenge, her mother's sealed medical records from years ago, which documented her breakdown, the anxiety, the prescriptions, all brought on by the humiliation the Wrights had engineered. Clara arranged for those records, with her mother's posthumous consent, to be included in a public ethics complaint filed by a victims advocacy group. Her mother's voice, long buried under forced silence, would now echo across every courtroom and article. She didn't flinch when her father called after nearly 2 decades of silence, his voice cracked and uncertain. "Clara," he had whispered, "we didn't know what else to do." Raymond said if we didn't protect the family name, it would all fall apart. She said nothing for a moment, her throat tight, her hands steady. "You didn't protect a family, you protected a lie." And she hung up gently, like closing a door she'd left open too long. That night, Clara watched the first headline roll in. The Wright legacy under federal investigation, new whistleblower alleges years of fraud. Her phone lit up with reporters, old classmates, even a few former teachers, all asking, "Is it really you?" And she replied only once, "Yes, I never left. You just stopped looking." But she wasn't finished yet. By the end of the week, Sycamore Hill was no longer a symbol of prestige, it had become the epicenter of scandal. The estate gates, once a barrier of status and wealth, now swung open daily to investigators, auditors, and journalists. Clara watched it all unfold like a conductor guiding an orchestra, each note a carefully planned consequence. Raymond Wright's face, once a staple of charity galas and magazine spreads, now appeared beneath bold headlines: philanthropist or fraud, and empire of lies. What few knew, and what Clara had designed perfectly, was that the evidence didn't just incriminate Raymond, it exposed a tangled web implicating several prominent board members, including Clara's own father. It was a deliberate choice, one she made with quiet anguish. But the truth couldn't be partial, and the price of betrayal wasn't negotiable. She remembered the moment clearly, age 16, sitting on the cold marble floor of the estate library, begging her father to believe her, to listen to what she had found, to stop Raymond. But his answer had been a door closing, the sound of him saying, "You're confused. Clara, let the adults handle this," followed by the sharp turn of a key as they locked away not just her evidence, but her voice. That silence had haunted her for years, had grown into something sharp and strong, and now, as subpoenas were served and headlines multiplied, it had become her blade. The town, once so eager to believe the Wright's charm, began to shift uncomfortably. Neighbors turned their backs when Raymond passed by. Former donors demanded accountability. The Wright Foundation's office was vandalized one night, red paint smeared across its logo spelling "thieves." Julian, drowning in scandal and panic, tried to pivot. He claimed ignorance in interviews, threw his father under the bus, and insisted on a generational disconnect. But Clara had anticipated that. Among the files she had submitted was a voice recording from 5 years. Earlier, Julian laughing at a dinner party about cutting corners with donor funds and funneling bonuses through ghost interns. When that leaked, Julian's last shred of credibility vanished. Within days, federal charges were filed. Conspiracy, fraud, obstruction. Clara knew better than to celebrate. Justice was slow and flawed, but momentum was now irreversible. In town, she finally walked openly again. She no longer wore sunglasses or hid her name. People stared, some with curiosity, others with recognition, and a few with guilt, but no one dared speak ill of her anymore. One afternoon outside the courthouse, a woman Clara barely remembered from high school stopped, her eyes glossy, voice shaking. "We were wrong about you," she said. "All of us." Clara didn't reply but nodded softly, her silence saying more than words could. She attended the first day of the federal hearing not for vengeance, but for closure. Raymond sat hunched in a gray suit that seemed too big for him now, his once proud posture replaced by resignation. Her father sat beside his legal counsel, avoiding her eyes. Clara sat alone in the public gallery, hands folded, watching. The prosecutor laid out the case with precision: stolen scholarships, fake charity reports, forged expense trails, and a deliberate smear campaign against the original whistleblower. That phrase struck deep, whistleblower. That's what they called her now in the papers. But Clara didn't feel like a whistleblower. She felt like someone who had simply refused to forget. When the court broke for recess, she walked out into the crisp air, her breath visible, the courthouse steps flooded with cameras. Reporters called her name. "Ms. Wright, did you always plan this? Is this revenge? What would your mother say now?" Clara paused only once. "My mother believed truth mattered," she said softly, "even when no one else did. That's why I'm here." That night, she visited the cemetery on the edge of town where her mother was buried. The gravestone was simple, weather-worn, surrounded by quiet autumn leaves. Clara sat beside it, placing a folded newspaper clipping, "Wright family under investigation," beside the roses. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "They won't bury another truth like they buried you." The wind rustled the leaves, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. By spring, the empire that once ruled Sycamore Hill had all but crumbled. Raymond Wright was convicted of financial fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy, sentenced to a decade in federal prison without the option of early parole. Julian took a plea deal, less time, but total financial ruin. Assets were seized, offshore accounts traced, property sold. Clara's father stepped down from all public boards and issued a public statement of regret and deep sorrow for past misjudgments. But Clara didn't bother to read it. She had already said her goodbye to him when she hung up the phone months ago, choosing not to return to a man who only called her daughter when the walls were closing in. Instead, she focused on what came after. Justice was never clean. It didn't sweep in and fix everything. It merely opened a door. Clara walked through that door with quiet dignity, never seeking praise, never needing recognition. Still, the world noticed. National papers ran editorials calling her the woman who dismantled a dynasty, and universities invited her to speak about truth and resilience. She declined most. She didn't need a stage. She needed healing. She bought a small cottage on the outskirts of town, not out of sentiment, but out of reclamation. It overlooked a gentle slope of land and a line of sycamore trees, their branches stretching wide like a crown of arms. Each morning, she drank her coffee on the porch and let the stillness settle around her like a blanket. She began teaching, part-time at a local community college, sharing her knowledge of financial law with young minds who still believed justice was worth chasing. Occasionally, she met someone who recognized her, who whispered, "Thank you," in the quiet hallways, and she would nod in return, not as a hero, but as a woman who simply refused to stay silent. Arav the journalist who had helped break the story, became a quiet fixture in her life. What began as cautious professional trust turned into something softer, deeper. He never tried to define her by the scars of her past, never treated her as a subject or a survivor, but simply as Clara. On long walks through the town she once ran from, they talked about literature, justice, grief, and the strange, stubborn strength of truth. He asked her once if she had any regrets. She thought for a long while and said, "Only that I waited so long to believe my voice mattered." He nodded and said nothing, knowing that some wounds never close, they just stop bleeding. When Sycamore Hill finally went up for auction, Clara didn't bid. She had no desire to live among those walls again, but she did visit once more before. The property was sold walking slowly through the grand foyer, the cracked marble floors, the dusty chandelier still hanging like a relic of a lie. In the library, she stood in the same spot where her life had been unraveled so long ago and let the silence settle again. Not heavy, not bitter, just there. She walked to the fireplace, lit a single match, and burned the last letter her father had ever written her unopened, unread, then turned and walked away. Closure wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a decision. She made hers in the stillness in time the town healed. And though some still whispered, most began to see Clara not as a scandal, but as a storm that had cleared the rot. Young women in town applied for the new scholarship fund she helped establish, one named after her mother, the Clara Wright Foundation for Ethical Justice. It was funded not by scandal money, but by crowdsourced donations and public trust. Clara handed out the first scholarship check in a small ceremony under the sycamore trees. The recipient, a 17-year-old girl named Lacey, hugged her and said, "I want to be like you." Clara smiled gently and replied, "Be braver than me. Speak sooner." And so the story of Sycamore Hill faded not with vengeance, but with transformation. What was once a fortress of lies became a cautionary tale, and what would have been a symbol of disgrace, Clara's name, became synonymous with strength, with justice, and with the beautiful, burning force of truth that refuses to die. Clara never called what she did revenge. She called it restoration. She didn't destroy a family. She revealed what it had already become. And as she stood beneath the blossoming sycamore trees, the wind lifting strands of her hair in the sun settling on her shoulders, she understood something she had never dared believe before. The past can bruise you, but it doesn't get to bury you, not if you rise.